The flames did not begin with fire, they began with silence, a silence so calculated, so controlled, that 12 men of wealth and power never heard the trap closing around them. Charleston's archives call her Isabella Montoya. To history, she is a footnote. To truth, she is the widow who sent 12 sugar barons to the flames in 1724, and yet, her story was never meant to be told. The colonial records sealed it, the planters buried it, and for 3 centuries her name was whispered only in fragments. But fragments are enough to reconstruct a nightmare. Imagine 12 men, owners of thousands of enslaved lives, men who trafficked in blood and sugar, laughing inside their council chamber. They believed themselves untouchable. They were wrong. Isabella moved among them like a ghost, a widow by circumstance but far from broken. She had watched the plantation world consume her family, seize her land, and turn human beings into cattle. For years she smiled when expected, bowed when demanded, and endured her role in silence. But beneath that silence, something was building. Knowledge, calculation, rage sharpened into strategy. When the council gathered that summer evening, they thought they were discussing profits, trade routes, and the next shipments from Havana. Instead, they walked into a chamber already primed for their destruction. What was found 3 days later defies every colonial explanation. 12 charred bodies arranged in a perfect circle, shackled in iron, their mouths stuffed with sugarcane stalks. At the center, the remains of a coal furnace burning hotter than any household hearth. And sitting beside it, Isabella Montoya, calm, deliberate, her hands blackened with soot, her eyes steady as she whispered a single phrase to the guards who dared approach her. "Sweetness feeds on blood." That line never made it into the official colonial records. It survives openly in a private journal of a soldier who stood at the scene. Authorities tried to erase it because words like those reveal more than murder. They reveal intent. They reveal justice. Tonight, you will hear what they tried to bury, the true story of Isabella Montoya, how one widow studied the psychology of power, the rituals of the sugar barons and the system that kept them untouchable, how she dismantled that system in a single night of fire and iron, and why her act of vengeance was more than personal. It was a message, a warning, and perhaps the beginning of a war no one dared name. Isabella Montoya was not born into darkness, she was forged by it. Her family name once carried weight in Cartagena, a port city where Spanish merchants fattened themselves on gold, slaves, and sugar. Her husband, Diego Montoya, had been one of them, a man whose wealth was written in chains. But wealth, like sugar, dissolves quickly in water. In 1719, Diego was poisoned at a banquet hosted by his rivals. Isabella, just 22, was left a widow without land, without protection, and without the veil of male ownership that kept women in their place. Most expected her to vanish quietly into dependency, absorbed by the same elite who had destroyed her. Instead, she stepped into the shadows, and in those shadows, she began to listen. She listened to the planters when they thought no one was listening. She listened at tables where wine blurred their tongues into confessions. She heard how they calculated human bodies like numbers on a ledger, how they debated torture methods as casually as recipes, and she never forgot a single word. What they failed to notice was that grief sharpens memory, loss hardens silence into steel. Isabella's silence was her weapon. She moved like a ghost through their gatherings, pouring rum, arranging papers, pretending to be the grieving widow desperate for survival. But every smile was a disguise, every bow a mask. Over 5 years she mapped their empire. She studied the trade routes, the slave ships, the councils where decisions were made. She tracked each man's weakness, Peterson's vanity, Harrington's paranoia, Fairfax's greed, Sutton's pride, and above all, she studied their rituals. For men of power always create rituals. It is how they convince themselves they are gods among mortals. In Charleston, these rituals revolved around sugar. They toasted it, burned it, coated their meats in it, spoke of it as though it were divine. Sugar was the sensei's, their god, and they were its priests. Isabella understood this better than they did. She saw that sugar was not sweet, it was blood crystallized, every grain bought with the bones of the enslaved, and so she chose her weapon not at random, but with precision. She would not kill them with blades or poison. She would kill them with their own symbol. She would force their god to turn against them. That was why, on that June night in 1724, she had the furnace prepared, the cane cut, and the circle of iron shackles laid out like a ritual of her own making, a ritual not of worship, but of reversal, a ritual of destruction. The plantation world of 1724 was a kingdom of illusions. Men who styled themselves as nobles were nothing more than merchants of flesh, addicted to sugar and the blood it demanded. But illusions only hold power when no one dares pierce them. Isabella Montoya dared. She began with patience, embedding herself where no one suspected danger, in the kitchens, the parlors, the meetings where these men plotted their dominion. The servants whispered that she had gone mad after her husband's death, that her eyes drifted like she was speaking to ghosts. The barons believed it, dismissing her as harmless. They did not see that madness itself can be a mask. What they never understood was the depth of her memory. Every insult, every cruelty she witnessed became a piece of her design. She catalogued their arrogance like a scholar catalogues texts. She knew which men took pleasure in watching their slaves whipped to death, which ones concealed bastard children in their fields, which bribed the governor to keep their blood-soaked profits intact. She even knew the precise hours when each of them was most vulnerable, the moments when liquor loosened their tongues, when lust led them into carelessness, when greed pulled their eyes from caution. These were not random observations. They were the foundation of a plan that required absolute precision. Her turning point came in the winter of 1723. The Sugar Council convened at the Harrington estate, a gathering that ended in blood. A young enslaved girl, no older than 13, had spilled a tray of wine. Harrington struck her down with the hilt of his sword, caving in her skull while the other barons laughed. Isabella carried the girl's body from the hall that night. Her hands trembled, but her face remained calm. That was the moment she decided there could be no escape, no silent survival. There could only be fire. From that night onward, he shifted her role from observer to architect. She began hoarding coal under the pretense of preparing for winter shortages. She collected iron shackles left unused in storage and polished them so they gleamed like new. She even tested the furnace herself late at night when the estate was silent, learning how to control the draft until she could raise the heat to an intensity no man could survive. Her preparations were meticulous because she knew she would have one chance, one night, one gathering when every enemy would be in the same room, and when that night came, she would not simply kill them. She would burn their illusions with them, reduce their empire to ash. The night of June 14th, 1724, the summons went out. 12 men, 12 barons of sugar, received word that Isabella Montoya would host them at her late husband's estate. The letter was simple, formal, written in her careful hand. It promised discussion of new shipping contracts, opportunities in Havana, and fresh connections to the Crown's treasuries. To men like these, opportunity outweighed caution. They accepted without hesitation. Why would they fear a widow? To them, she was powerless. To them, she existed only as a tool of hospitality, a hostess to be used, pitied, or ignored. Their mistake was not merely arrogance. It was blindness. They could not imagine a woman bending the machinery of their own system against them. That week, Isabella walked through the halls of her estate like a conductor before a symphony. She checked the coal stocks twice over. She sharpened the blades that would secure their shackles. She instructed her few trusted servants in hushed tones, those enslaved men and women who had lost everything to the barons and who understood, without words, the necessity of what was about to occur. They were not soldiers, but witnesses, witnesses to ensure the story would survive, even if Isabella did not. The sugar barons arrived in pairs and small groups, carriages rolling across the gravel drive beneath the blistering summer sun. They were greeted with wine imported from Madeira, with roasted meats seasoned in molasses, with music soft enough to ease suspicion, but not so loud as to drown the whispers of their business. Isabella played her role flawlessly. She smiled, she bowed, she poured their glasses. The men laughed, traded boasts of their plantations, and spoke of slaves as though they were tools stacked in a warehouse. Their words, as always, revealed more than they intended, and Isabella listened one last time. When the hour struck midnight, the barons moved into the council chamber. It was here that Isabella's trap had been set. The furnace glowed with an unnatural intensity, its iron mouth open like a beast hungry for sacrifice. Around it, 12 chairs had been placed in a circle, each with a set of polished shackles lying in wait. To the barons, this was novelty, an eccentric flourish by a widow eager to impress her betters. They laughed at her theatrics, believing themselves in control of the ritual about to unfold. None of them noticed the door had been barred from the outside. None of them realized until it was too late that they had stepped willingly into a ritual not of power, but of judgment. The doors slammed shut with a thunderous echo rattling the chamber's stone walls. The laughter of the barons faltered. At first they thought it a mistake, a gust of wind, a servant's clumsy hand. But then they heard it, the heavy scrape of iron bolts sliding into place from the outside, the sound of a prison ceiling. One man rose to protest, but his words were drowned by the roar of the furnace as Isabella stoked it higher, flames licking against its iron throat, casting a glow that painted every face in crimson. She no longer smiled. The mask was gone. In its place was a silence that unnerved them more than any scream. Her eyes swept across the circle, and for the first time the barons saw her not as a widow, not as a hostess, but as something ancient and unyielding, a judge who had already written their verdict. She did not speak immediately. She let the silence rot, let fear begin its slow work, until their shifting, their uneasy coughs, became confessions without words. "You took my husband," she said at last, her voice steady as stone. "You took my brothers. You took the lives of hundreds who labored in your fields until their bones turned to dust in the cane." She stepped closer to the circle, the heat of the furnace framing her in a glow that seemed more fire than flesh. "You believed there would never be a reckoning. You believed no one would dare." One of the barons sneered, forcing bravado into his voice. "This is madness, woman. Release us, and perhaps your life will be spared." But even as he spoke, his eyes darted to the furnace, betraying the fear behind his bluster. Isabella's lips curved, not in mirth, but in disdain. The shackles glimmered at their feet, and with a gesture, her servants stepped from the shadows, armed not with swords, but with iron rods pulled glowing hot from the flames. The barons lurched back, realizing too late that every chair was a trap, every link of chain already waiting for them. The air thickened with the stench of burning coal and rising terror. One man lunged for the door, but it did not yield. The others pressed against the walls, their wealth and power useless in this chamber where fire, not gold, ruled. Isabella lifted her hand and the furnace roared higher, sparks spiraling upward like souls clawing at the heavens. "Tonight," she said, voice low and final, "the scales are balanced." The first to fall was not the loudest nor the boldest, but the weakest. A baron at the edge of the circle stumbled back as Isabella's servant drove a searing rod against his chest. The smell of singed cloth and flesh ripped through the chamber, and his scream broke the fragile silence. In desperation he fought against the chain binding his ankles, but the iron dug deep, anchoring him to his fate. With one violent shove, the servant thrust him forward closer to the furnace's maw. The baron's cries turned to pleas, begging for mercy, promising land, silver, anything that could buy his soul back from the fire. But Isabella only watched, her face lit by the inferno's glow. "Your coin cannot bribe the grave," she whispered, too quiet for most to hear, yet it carried like a curse. When the flames kissed him, the chamber erupted in chaos. The heat surged outward, and the baron's shrieks clawed at the stone walls as his body writhed against the inevitable. The others recoiled, pressing themselves against the walls, their faces ghostly in the red light. Men who had ruled plantations, who had crushed rebellions without mercy, now trembled like children awaiting the rod. Another tried to rise, wrenching at the shackle around his ankle, but Isabella's men were swift. Two seized him by the arms, forcing him forward, his boots scraping against the stone floor. He spat curses, invoking God, vowing vengeance from his bloodline, but even his threats broke apart into screams as the heat wrapped around him. His voice joined the first, two howls twisted together, swallowed by fire. The furnace roared like a beast finally fed, and its glow grew brighter, throwing sparks into the vaulted ceiling. Sweat rolled down Isabella's brow, but her eyes never wavered. She stood unmoved, a statue of judgment, as one by one, the barons realized there would be no bargain, no escape, no morning to crawl into. Panic stripped them of their pride. They clawed at each other, shoved one another closer to the fire, voices breaking into prayers, into curses, into madness. Chains rattled, flesh seared, and the chamber filled with smoke and the stench of burning power. Isabella raised her hand, and in the crackle of the furnace, her voice carried above the screams, "One flame for every life you stole." The chamber was no longer a court of power. It was a pit of animals snarling and scrambling for air as the fire devoured the first of them. The chains that bound them together became weapons. One man wrapped his links around another's throat, strangling him in blind desperation, hoping that by offering another life, his own might be spared. The choking victim clawed at his attacker's face until both collapsed, tangled in iron and sweat, their screams echoing against the stone. Isabella did not interfere. She let the scene unfold, her arms crossed, her eyes sharp and cold. To her, this was justice taking its natural form, tyrants revealing themselves as cowards when the veil of control was stripped away. Their polished coats were now streaked with ash, their powdered wigs scattered on the floor, their voices cracked and raw. They were no longer masters of plantations, they were prey. One baron, shaking so violently his teeth rattled, turned on his companion. "It was him! He betrayed us! He called the meeting!" His words cracked like glass, each syllable rising with madness. He shoved the man beside him toward the furnace, trying to buy himself another breath, another heartbeat. The accused man fought back, biting, clawing, his fingernails leaving bloody streaks across his accuser's face. The others shrieked and wailed, some throwing themselves to the floor in prayer, some beating their fists bloody against the stone, as though sheer will could break them free. Their polished boots slipped in the blood and soot, and the once proud chamber of order had become a slaughterhouse of desperation. The furnace roared louder, feeding on their terror, and sparks drifted into the air like fiery omens. The stone walls seemed to pulse with heat, glowing red in patches, as if the chamber itself hungered for their destruction. Through it all, Isabella remained still. A flicker of satisfaction crossed her lips as she watched them betray each other, tearing at their comrades, dragging each other closer to the flame. She had no need to lift a blade or issue a command. Fear was her executioner, panic her gallows. "Your empire," she said softly, though her voice cut through the madness like steel, "was built on chains. Tonight, those chains deliver you to the fire." Amid the frenzy, one man stood apart. Not calm, but towering in his rage. Baron Alvaro de Rios, the wealthiest of them all, the man whose lands stretched further than the eye could see, whose cruelty was whispered of in every hut and cane field. Even chained, even drenched in sweat and trembling under the furnace's glow, he carried himself like a beast unwilling to bow. His voice cut through the chamber louder than the screams, a deep, commanding growl. "Silence!" he bellowed, and for a heartbeat the others froze. Their terror bent to him out of old habit, like dogs who remembered the lash. He seized the chain that bound him to a weaker lord and yanked, dragging the man to his knees as if to remind them all who still ruled here. His chest heaved, his eyes burned, but there was no surrender in him, only fury. Isabella stepped forward, her shadow slicing across the chaos. Her gaze locked on him, and in that instant the chamber seemed to shrink to the space between them. "Baron de Rios," she said, her voice steady, deliberate. "You built your kingdom on fire and flesh. Tell me, does it feel familiar now, standing so close to the furnace?" He spat at her feet, his lips curling back in a snarl. "Witch!" he hissed. You'll burn with us. The crown will see your corpse rotting in chains." His defiance was met with murmurs, half fear, half hope, that maybe he could still command the order, maybe he could rally them against her. But Isabella only smiled, slow and cruel, as though she had been waiting for this moment. She lifted the iron poker resting against the furnace, its tip glowing red. Sparks hissed as she dragged it across the stone floor. "No, Baron," she whispered, her words meant for him alone, but loud enough to poison the air. "The crown will never find me, but tonight, every soul in this chamber will remember you." The others turned on him with sudden hatred, their fear seeking a target. Accusations flew, hands clawed, voices cracked. They shoved him, cursed him, spit in his face, desperate to make him the sacrifice. The most powerful man among them was being dragged down by the same cowards who once knelt before him. And Isabella, she only watched, her eyes glinting in the furnace's light, knowing that the empire of Baron de Rios was crumbling with every shove, every scream, every lick of fire. The chains rattled as the others shoved him to the ground. For the first time in years, Baron de Rios tasted dirt and blood, his jaw cracking against the stone floor. The men who once bowed at his table now kicked at his ribs, spat on his face, cursed him as the reason for their doom. But still he laughed, a low, guttural roar that echoed like a beast in its death throes. His defiance clung to him like armor, and Isabella knew she had to strip it away piece by piece. She stepped closer, iron poker in hand, its tip still glowing like a coal torn from hell. The room stank of sweat, blood, and burning metal. The Baron lifted his head, eyes wild, lips split open in a bloody grin. "Strike me down, girl," he rasped. "I will not beg. My blood is older, purer, than anything that ever touched your veins." Isabella crouched before him, close enough that he could see the flecks of ash on her skin. She tilted her head, studying him as one might study an animal before slaughter. Then, without a word, she pressed the glowing iron against the gold ring on his finger. The metal hissed, his flesh sizzled, his laughter snapped into a howl. He writhed, trying to pull away, but the chains bit into his wrists and ankles. Isabella's voice cut through his agony, soft and steady, as if she were reciting a prayer. "This ring, bought with the lives of those you starved, this gold, mined by the children you whipped. Let it sink into your skin, let it brand you for what you are." The Baron clawed at the stone, veins bulging, spittle flying from his lips as he screamed. The other lords recoiled, their eyes wide, their breath shallow. They had feared him for decades, but now they saw him as just another man, stripped of title, stripped of power, just another body waiting for the fire. Isabella stood, letting the iron clatter to the floor. The mark on his hand glowed red, the flesh charred and blistering, his voice cracking into sobs he tried to hide. She leaned over him, her words slicing deeper than the burn. "Look at you, a baron on his knees. The crown cannot save you. Your gold cannot save you. All that's left is the fire." For the first time, Baron de Rios did not reply. His silence was louder than any scream. His empire had ended, not in battle, not in rebellion, but in humiliation. Beneath the shadow of a furnace he could no longer command. The furnace roared in the corner, its glow spilling across the stone walls like the mouth of a demon waiting to swallow them whole. The heat pressed down on the room, suffocating, making sweat drip into the eyes of the bound lords who once dined in silk halls and issued commands with a flick of their jeweled hands. Now they huddled together like frightened cattle, their chains clinking as they shifted, watching Isabella pace before them. She stopped suddenly, the fire painting her face in flickers of red. "You've lived your lives feeding on the backs of others," she said, her voice calm, almost conversational. "Every meal you've eaten, every coin you've spent, was bought with blood that wasn't yours. Tonight, that debt comes due, but—" She let the word hang in the thick, smoke-filled air. "Not all of you will meet the fire at once." The lords froze. Their eyes darted to one another, suspicion blooming like rot in a wound. Isabella smiled faintly, drawing a long iron bar from beside the furnace, its tip glowing white. She pointed it at them, one by one like a judge passing sentence. You will decide who enters first. One of you will be fed to the flames before the others. Choose, or I choose for you. A murmur of horror rippled through the room. Baron de Rios groaned on the floor, still broken from his humiliation, but the others erupted, pleas, bargains, and accusations flooding the air. "It should be him!" one shouted, pointing at a trembling old man whose powdered wig had slipped sideways. "He's half dead already. What difference does it make?" The old man shrieked, clutching at the chains around his wrists. "Lies! I gave bread to the poor in famine years. You all know it. If anyone belongs in there, it's the Duke. He bled the mines dry." The Duke spat, his face twisting. "Better a miner starve than a child trafficked for your profit. You disgust me." Their ears turned to claws, their voices to knives. They no longer remembered unity, only survival. The chains clattered as they pushed, shoved, and cursed each other like animals trapped in a cage. Isabella watched in silence, her expression unreadable, as the once mighty reduced themselves to rats tearing each other apart. When at last the shouting broke into sobs, Isabella raised her hand. The room went still. "Enough." She stepped forward, her eyes cold, her voice sharper than the iron in her grasp. "You've condemned each other with your own tongues. You show me the truth better than fire ever could. You are cowards, every one of you." She turned to the youngest among them, a trembling man no older than 30. His face was pale, his lips quivering as though words might save him. She lifted the iron, gesturing toward the furnace. "You'll be the first." His scream tore through the chamber as the others recoiled, their chains rattling. They had chosen nothing, yet in their desperation they had chosen everything. The young noble thrashed against his chains as Isabella's men seized him. His cries ricocheted off the stone walls, sharp and panicked, echoing like the death song of a bird caught in a predator's claws. He clawed at the ground with bound hands, leaving streaks of blood across the dirt floor as they dragged him closer to the furnace. The heat grew unbearable, waves of fire licking the chamber, blistering his skin before he even reached the mouth of the inferno. "Please," he shrieked, his voice cracking under terror. "I'll give you everything. Lands, gold, men. Just don't." His plea dissolved into a howl as one guard pressed his face near the glowing bars of the furnace door, the skin already peeling from the heat. The other nobles recoiled, some collapsing to their knees, others turning their heads but unable to escape the smell, the stench of sweat, fear, and the metallic bite of blood mingling with smoke. One woman vomited, choking as she tried to crawl away, though her chains pulled her back. Isabella stood unmoved, her gaze locked on the condemned man. "Gold cannot buy back the years you stole," she whispered, though her words carried over the screams. With a nod, she signaled the guards. They heaved, forcing his body upward. His legs kicked, his back arched, his voice cracked into a final, desperate roar. For a moment time slowed. The nobles saw his wide, terror-stricken eyes, saw the reflection of the fire devouring them all in its glow. Then he was thrust inside. The furnace swallowed him whole. A sound erupted that none in the room would ever forget. Not a scream, not entirely human, but a shriek fused with the roar of flames, a sound of flesh and soul being consumed. The chamber filled with the sickening crackle of burning hair and snapping bone. Smoke poured upward, thick and black, curling into the ceiling like a curse. The remaining nobles collapsed into silence. Their eyes widened, their bodies trembling, their lips pressed tight as if afraid even to breathe too loudly. None dared speak, but their thoughts were clear. The fire would claim them too, one by one. Isabella turned her back to the furnace, her face lit by its glow. The silence pleased her. Fear, pure and undiluted, now ruled the room. She let it hang there like a noose. "You see," she said softly, almost tenderly, "this is not death, this is justice, and justice does not stop with one." The nobles shivered, bound together in chains that now felt heavier than iron. The first body still crackled inside the furnace when Isabella lifted her hand again. No respite, no moment to breathe. Her guards understood the command without words. They reached into the trembling mass of chained nobles and wrenched another free. This one was older, a man with silver hair and trembling lips. He had been a lord once, known for his cruelty in trade and his delight in punishment. But now his body sagged like wet cloth, his power stripped from him. His voice was broken by fear as he begged, his words spilling in gasps. "Mercy, Signora, please, please, I was not the worst of them. Let me prove my loyalty. I can serve you, I can—" His pleas disintegrated when the guards struck him hard across the jaw, silencing his tongue with blood. The nobles pulled away instinctively, trying to make themselves invisible in the shadows, though the chains bound them tight. Every eye followed the old man's slow drag across the floor. His heels left 2 long trails in the dirt, streaked with blood and ash. The closer he came to the furnace, the louder his sobs grew, until they collapsed into raw, childlike wails. Isabella leaned close to him, her voice steady, unshaken. "Your life was built on the screams of others. Tonight, you finally hear your own." He shook his head violently, tears cutting through the grime on his face. "No, no, 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 please." The words became frantic, a rhythm of despair. The guards forced his arms upward, pushing him against the searing door. His skin blistered instantly, steam hissing from his flesh. His body convulsed in agony as he shrieked like a dying animal, his knees buckling beneath him. Then came the push. His body slid into the furnace with a forceful shove, swallowed by the roar of fire. For a moment his arms flailed, his fingers clawing at the iron frame, skin melting as he tried to resist the inevitable. Then, like parchment, too, hay burned away. The nobles screamed with him this time, not just him, all of them. A chorus of horror erupted from the chained crowd, their voices clashing against the thunder of flames. Their cries rose, shrill and hopeless, bouncing off the stone walls as though the chamber itself mocked them. The air thickened with burning flesh. The smell was unbearable, clinging to their throats, settling into their lungs. Some gagged, some sobbed, some clawed at the floor like trapped animals, but none could escape. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling the scent of justice as though it was incense. When she opened them again, her gaze swept the chamber with icy calm. 2 have paid, she said. 12 remain. The silence that followed was worse than the screams. The furnace had not yet finished devouring the old man's body when Isabella raised her hand once more. The guards obeyed instantly, dragging another noble out of the trembling cluster. This time it was a younger man, no more than 30. His face was pale, but his eyes blazed with something the others had already lost, defiance. He stumbled forward but did not beg, his lips curling in rage even as his body shook. "You think this makes you righteous?" he spat, blood and spit flying from his mouth. "You're nothing but a savage. You'll burn in hell beside us." The guards shoved him hard, forcing him to his knees before the furnace. He thrashed, kicking wildly, his chains rattling like frantic bells. For a moment, his fury seemed to give him strength. He broke free of one guard's grasp, lunging forward with a roar, but Isabella did not flinch. She stepped closer, her presence suffocating. One look from her silenced the room. "Hell?" she said, her voice calm, almost curious. "Hell is not waiting for you. Hell is here." The guards seized him again, pinning his arms. He fought like an animal, teeth bared, eyes blazing with hatred. His voice rose into a curse meant to cut her down, but before he could finish, Isabella nodded. The furnace door groaned open. Heat poured out like the breath of a demon, curling the hair and blistering the skin of those closest. The noble screamed, not in fear, but in fury, as he was hurled into the fire. His voice erupted in one final, earth-shattering howl that cracked into a gurgle as flames devoured his lungs. The chamber shook with the violence of it. His body writhed inside, thrashing against the iron, his screams echoing off the stone until they dissolved into silence. The nobles recoiled as one, pressing against their chains, faces twisted with horror. The first had begged, the second had sobbed, but the third had cursed until the fire ripped the breath from his chest. His defiance left them with no comfort, no script to follow. Isabella watched the fire until his movement stilled. Then slowly she turned back to the trembling crowd. Her eyes scanned each face, one by one, until no man could bear to meet her gaze. 3 gone, she whispered. 11 remain. The silence that followed was unbearable, a silence so heavy it crushed the nobles beneath it. They knew now, this was no spectacle, it was annihilation. The chamber reeked of scorched flesh and molten iron. The nobles huddled together like frightened cattle, but their unity was already unraveling. 3 had burned. The number haunted them like a curse. One of the older men collapsed to his knees, clutching at another's robe. Please, please, speak for me. You have influence. She'll listen to you." His voice cracked like a child's. The man shoved him away in disgust, his own face pale and sweating. Another began to mutter prayers under his breath, words tumbling out in a broken rhythm. But the one beside him hissed, "Shut up, you'll only anger her more." Their whispers rose, sharp and frantic, like rats gnawing each other in a cage. Isabella watched with icy detachment, her eyes flicking over them as they tore at one another with words sharper than knives. Then she raised her hand. The guards moved instantly, dragging another noble forward. The fourth was a woman, her silk gown torn, her jeweled hair disheveled. She was the wife of one of the men already taken, her face hollow from the shock of watching her husband's flesh melt inside the furnace. She stumbled as the guards forced her to her knees, her lips trembling, her hands clawing desperately at the stone floor. "No, no, not me. I am innocent. I never raised a hand. I never touched a whip." Her voice cracked in hysterical sobs. She looked up at Isabella with wild, bloodshot eyes. "I begged him not to. I begged him to stop. I prayed for your kind. I did. You must believe me." The furnace door opened again, belching heat that rolled through the chamber. The woman shrieked, her body convulsing in panic. She clawed at the guards, leaving deep scratches in their arms, her screams rising higher, sharper, until they pierced the ears like knives. The other nobles turned their faces away, but not out of pity, their expressions twisted with a new kind of terror, because if even she, a woman, a wife, was not spared, then none of them had a chance. Isabella stepped closer, her shadow falling across the woman's writhing form. "Innocence," she said softly, almost like a lullaby. "It burned the moment you dined at their tables. It burned when you wore their jewels, drank their wine, and lived on their stolen blood." The woman's final scream echoed as she was hurled into the furnace. The flames consumed her instantly, snapping her body into contorted shapes before swallowing her whole. 4 gone, 10 remained. Isabella turned to face them again. The air was heavy with smoke and madness. The nobles stared at her with hollow eyes, and for the first time their terror began to curdle into something else, desperation. The chamber had become a cage of panic. 4 had burned. The number hung in the air like a curse carved into their skulls. The 12 survivors no longer looked like nobles. Their silks clung to sweat-soaked bodies. Their jewels rattled as trembling hands clawed at rosaries, charms, or the folds of their robes. Dignity had rotted away. One of them snapped first. A thin, sharp-nosed man with trembling lips leapt forward and threw himself at Isabella's feet. His knees cracked against the stone, his hands clawing at her dress. "I can help you," he screamed. "I know where they keep the gold, the hidden vaults beneath the port. I'll tell you everything, just spare me. Burn another. Burn him." His finger shot toward one of his companions, a heavy-set man with a powdered wig. The accused roared in outrage and lunged at him, fists smashing against his face. The 2 crashed to the ground, clawing, biting, their screams and curses echoing in the furnace-lit hall. Blood spattered across the stone. The others pulled back, their own faces twisting in terror and fury. One woman shrieked, "Stop it! You'll make her choose faster." Another hissed, "Better him than me." Their voices rose like a storm, pleading, accusing, cursing, praying, until the chamber was filled with a chorus of human collapse. Isabella stood unmoving. Her silence was more suffocating than their chaos. She let them tear into each other like wild dogs. The furnace glowed behind her, a steady, hungry breath, waiting. At last, she lifted her hand. The guards tore the brawling men apart, dragging the sharp-nosed traitor forward. His face was a mess of blood and tears, his eyes bulging with terror. "No! You promised if I spoke you'd spare me!" His voice cracked, high-pitched, almost childlike. Isabella leaned close, her words colder than the iron door. "I promised nothing. You gave me his blood to save. Your own. That makes you filth twice over." The furnace door yawned open. The man's screams clawed through the chamber as they hurled him into the blaze. His body writhed, twisted, and vanished into the flames. 5 gone. 11 remained. The survivors pressed against the walls now, as if the stone could swallow them and hide them from her eyes. But their gazes no longer met. Each one watched the others with suspicion, as though the next betrayal might come from the friend closest to them. The fear of Isabella's fire was nothing compared to the fear of each other. The chamber had shifted. It no longer felt like a trial, but a plague house, disease crawling from one trembling soul to the next. No one trusted the silence between them anymore. Every cough, every shuffle of shoes, every twitch of the eye carried suspicion. 5 gone. 11 remained. But each survivor looked as if a shadow of themselves had already burned away. The woman with the rosary beads clutched them so tightly her palms bled. Her prayers slipped into frantic whispers, muttering Latin half-remembered, half-invented, as though noise itself could shield her. Another noble, pale and gaunt, hissed at her through cracked lips. "Shut up, witch! Your prayers bring the fire closer." His hand shot out, snatching at her beads, yanking them so hard they broke. Wooden fragments scattered across the floor like seeds of despair. The woman shrieked, clawing at his face, nails raking his skin until blood streaked his cheek. The others did not intervene. They only watched, wide-eyed, their terror flickering between fascination and relief. So long as someone else lost control, maybe the fire would not call their name. Isabella raised her hand. The room froze. Her gesture was small, almost lazy, but it struck them like thunder. The guard seized the pale noble with the bleeding cheek. He thrashed, spitting curses, insisting the woman had started it. His words turned desperate, broken. "I am loyal, I am faithful, it wasn't me, please, God." The furnace opened. Its heat washed over them like a tidal wave, drying the sweat on their faces to salt. The man screamed until his voice cracked into a hoarse rattle. His body writhed against the guard's grip, legs kicking uselessly at the stone. The roar of the fire swallowed his last plea as he vanished into its mouth. 6 gone, 10 remained. The silence that followed was worse than his screams. They stared at one another, their faces twisted, eyes hollow. The woman with the broken rosary sat shaking, her lips raw from whispering prayers that no longer sounded like words. No one dared move, no one dared breathe too loudly. The furnace did not just burn flesh, it burned trust, faith and hope, until only ash remained. And Isabella? She stood still, her expression unreadable, her eyes reflecting the firelight like a predator who had not yet tired of the hunt. The tension finally cracked. The chamber had become a nest of eyes, every gaze sharp, every glance a threat. They no longer looked at Isabella as one enemy, they looked at one another as predators circling prey. 10 left, 10 waiting for the fire. A gaunt man with trembling hands pointed suddenly at a heavy-set merchant. It was him. He whispered to the guards last night. I heard him. He bargains while we starve. His voice was wild, cracked from fear, but it carried the sting of desperation. The merchant lurched forward, shaking his head violently. Lies! He lies! He's the traitor! He plots with her, with the woman who killed us! His finger jabbed toward Isabella, as though saying her name would somehow shield him. 2 others jumped in, snarling accusations of their own. Voices rose, each trying to shout louder than the last. The air turned sharp. manic. Fingers pointed, curses flew, bodies shoved against each other. In the chaos, trust split into shards, and no one could tell where truth ended and madness began. The guards didn't wait for Isabella's command this time. They dragged the merchant forward, his cries shrill and pitiful. He begged the others to defend him, but not one spoke, not one lifted a hand. The furnace door screamed open. The merchant's face twisted as he was hurled inside, his last words mangled by the roar of fire. A curse upon them all, a promise that they would join him soon. His voice was swallowed whole, leaving only the crackle of flames and the stench of burning flesh. 7 gone. 9 remained. The silence afterward was jagged. Every chest rose and fell too quickly. Every pair of eyes darted nervously from face to face. No one could trust anyone now. The woman with the broken rosary began laughing. Not loud, but soft, hysterical chuckles that made the hairs on the others' necks rise. Her prayers had failed, her beads lay shattered, bent, and now her mind was unraveling before their eyes. "God is watching," she whispered through her laughter. "But he isn't coming." And in the corner, Isabella smiled for the first time. Her laughter didn't stop. It rattled in the stone chamber like broken glass rolling in a jar, sharp, uneven, impossible to ignore. The woman with the rosary pressed her hand to her chest as though she were clutching something holy, but her fingers only clawed at skin. Her beads had fallen hours ago, crushed beneath boots, yet she kept fingering the empty air as if the rosary still existed. The others shifted back. Fear of her madness was worse than fear of the guards. Madness had no pattern, no bargain. Madness could turn on anyone, at any time. She began reciting prayers, words spilling in fragments, twisted, tangled. "Deliver us, no, cast us, furnace of hell, furnace of fire, furnace of men." Her head jerked violently, and a scream tore out of her throat so sudden and raw that 2 men stumbled back as though she'd lunged at them. Then she smiled, a wide, cracked grin. "You don't understand," she whispered. "The fire isn't killing us. It's feeding on us." Her eyes flicked toward Isabella, then back to the others. "Every soul burned makes it stronger, and when it's done with us, it won't stop." The words hung like poisoned smoke. A trembling farmhand muttered, "She's cursed. She's calling it to us." He moved toward her with sudden violence, but another survivor grabbed his arm. "Wait, no, we can't waste each other like this. That's what she wants. That's what the fire wants." Their grips locked, eyes burning into each other, both desperate to turn fear into action. For the first time, alliances sparked. 3 survivors huddling in the shadows, whispering about escape. 2 men pressing together as though trust could be forged in an instant. The farmhand snarling that unless the madwoman was silenced, they'd all be next. The chamber had become a battlefield of whispered promises and fractured loyalties. The woman only laughed again, her voice rising to a shriek that almost drowned out the hiss of the furnace. "You think you're choosing who dies next," she said, "but you're wrong. It's already chosen." The guards stepped forward. Their boots struck stone like a verdict. The survivors froze. The fire was hungry, and it was time for the 8th. The guards waited with the stillness of vultures, letting the survivors choose their own ruin. That was the cruelty of it. They didn't need to drag anyone. They only had to watch. All eyes went to the woman with the broken rosary. She was already half gone, muttering, shrieking, clawing at the air. Every soul in the chamber knew she should be the one taken. Even the guards' torches seemed to lean toward her. But she wasn't afraid. She met their stares with a cracked grin, whispering, "The fire loves me. It won't touch me. It's chosen one of you." And suddenly, doubt poisoned the air. What if she was right? What if burning her would only feed the fire's hunger faster? The survivor's logic twisted under the weight of terror. The farmhand snapped. He shoved forward, finger stabbing toward a boy in the corner, barely 16, silent, shaking. "Him! He hasn't said a word since the start. Look at him! He's hiding something. He's marked." The boy's eyes widened. He shook his head, stammering, but his voice was drowned in shouts. "She's right. The fire chooses. No, he's weak. He'll slow us down. Better him than us." It happened in a storm. Hands grabbed him, dragging him out while he screamed. His pleas scraped against the stone, begging for mercy, but fear deafened them all. Even those who didn't join in stood frozen, powerless, relieved it wasn't them. The guards didn't resist. They stepped aside, letting the mob deliver their own sacrifice. When the boy was thrown to the furnace, the chamber fell into silence except for the crackle of flames swallowing him whole. The smell hit first. Hair, flesh, innocence burning. The madwoman clapped her hands once, like a child amused. "The fire thanks you," she said, smiling through the shadows. "But it's still hungry." The others turned on her with murder in their eyes. But deep down, none could deny the truth. The fire was stronger now. And they had given it the boy. The silence after the boy's screams was heavier than the smoke that clung to their throats. No one wanted to look at each other. Every survivor saw their own guilt reflected in the others' faces. They had killed him. Not the guards, not Isabella, not even the fire. Them. The farmhand who first accused the boy was shaking, hands stained with ash. He muttered, "It had to be done. It had to." But his voice cracked, and no one spoke to ease his torment. Even those who had helped drag the boy stared at the floor, afraid of their own thoughts. The madwoman was humming, a lullaby broken and sweet. Every note gnawed at their nerves. That's when Isabella stepped forward. Her gown shimmered faintly in the torchlight, a cruel reminder of her untouchable place above them. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. "You understand now," she said softly, almost tenderly. "The fire isn't punishment. It's revelation. It shows you who you truly are when no priest, no law, no heaven is watching." She walked slowly between them, her presence slicing open their shame. "You gave the boy. You tore him apart with your own hands. And still—" She gestured toward the furnace, where the flames hissed and licked as if mocking them. "You feel no safer." The farmhand fell to his knees, whispering, "Please, no more, no more." Isabella leaned down, her lips brushing his ear. "There will always be more. The fire is endless, and I will keep you here until you understand that truth." The others shifted back, but not from her, rather from themselves. No one trusted the person beside them anymore. A glance was no longer a glance. It was suspicion. Every silence was accusation. One woman began sobbing into her hands. Another clenched her fists, ready to kill at the first hint of blame. The chamber was turning into a pit of knives, every soul cutting the others to keep from being cut first. And Isabella smiled, because she knew. Now they were hers completely. The guards were no longer needed. Fear had made the survivors into executioners, and shame had bound them to her furnace. The fire roared as if pleased. The chamber was too small to hold that much guilt. Every breath scraped like glass. Eyes darted, hands twitched, whispers curled like smoke between clenched teeth. Then it broke. The farmhand, the same man who had dragged the boy, suddenly lunged at the woman sobbing in the corner. His voice cracked into madness. "It was you. You whispered his name. You cursed us all." He slammed her against the stone wall with a strength born from terror, fists pummeling her face until bones snapped beneath his blows. Screams tore through the room. Some tried to pull him off, but he swung wildly, striking anyone who came close. Blood sprayed across the floor, dark against the fire's glow. The woman's shrieks choked into silence as her skull cracked open against the stone. The others froze, paralyzed, unsure whether to stop him or join him. Because in that frenzy they saw something they hadn't admitted aloud. The violence was release. The furnace had demanded a child, but the fire in their heads now demanded more. Isabella didn't intervene. She stood perfectly still, her eyes reflecting the flames. When the farmhand finally collapsed, trembling, his hands dripping with gore, she walked to him like a mother consoling her broken child. She cupped his bloodied face. "You've seen it now," she whispered. "The fire doesn't just consume flesh, it consumes the lies you told yourself, that you were innocent, that you were righteous. No, you are what the fire shows you." The others stood in a circle of dread, staring at the woman's body sprawled in the dirt. No one moved to cover her. No one prayed. Instead, one man muttered, "Maybe she was cursed." Another answered, "Then we're all cursed." A laugh, dry, broken, rose from someone in the back. It spread in jagged echoes until half of them were chuckling through tears, the sound of sanity snapping like brittle twigs. Isabella let it grow. And it filled the chamber like smoke, until the survivors themselves could no longer tell if they were laughing or sobbing. The fire roared again, and the smell of fresh blood mingled with ash, and still no one dared look at the furnace too long. The laughter faded into ragged breathing. Some sat slumped against the wall, others rocked back and forth, their eyes hollow, as if their souls had been scorched out of them. Blood smeared across the stone. The dead woman lay twisted, her mouth frozen in an open scream. No one touched her, no one dared. That was when Isabella spoke. Her voice was steady, cutting through the silence like a blade through cloth. "Do you see now? The fire was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to reveal you, what you are, what you've hidden even from yourselves." They stared at her, trembling, like beaten dogs, unsure whether she would strike or soothe. She knelt beside the furnace, resting her hand on the hot iron door. The hiss of searing flesh filled the chamber, but she didn't flinch. The smell of her burning palm wrapped around them like incense. "This pain," she whispered, "is clarity, and clarity is freedom. The fire has stripped away the lies of mercy, of law, of the false God you prayed to while spilling blood in the shadows of your lives." Her words settled over them like ash. Some shook their heads, muttering prayers under their breath, clinging to fragments of the faith that had abandoned them. But others listened. Their eyes flicked toward the furnace not with fear, but with something darker, recognition. One man, his shirt soaked in another's blood, crawled forward. What do we do?" His voice cracked like a child's. Isabella leaned down, her burnt hand trembling but unwavering as she touched his cheek. "You do what must be done. You cleanse what remains. The fire has chosen who survives, and who must be fed to keep the truth alive." A murmur rippled through the room. A low hum of surrender. The farmhand, still shaking, raised his bloody fists. "Who?" he demanded. "Who's next?" Isabella's lips curled into something between a smile and a wound. "The fire will show you." The survivors turned on each other in silence, eyes scanning, calculating, waiting for the smallest sign of weakness to justify the next sacrifice. The furnace crackled, hungry, and for the first time they no longer feared it. The silence shattered when the youngest boy, no older than 16, pointed a trembling finger toward an old man hunched in the corner. "Him. He's weak. He was the first to break." The old man's eyes went wide. "No, please, no." He tried to crawl away, clawing at the stone, but the others surged forward like wolves that had finally learned the taste of blood. His cries echoed in the furnace chamber as they dragged him across the floor, his fingernails snapping against the stone. "Stop, please!" he wailed, but no one stopped. They heaved him into the furnace. The fire roared, swallowing his body whole. The stench of burning flesh rolled through the air, heavy, suffocating. Some gagged, others stared, glassy-eyed, entranced. Isabella stood still, her charred hand pressed against her chest, her eyes glimmering in the firelight. "This is not murder," she said softly, almost tender. "This is offering." Her words burrowed into them. The farmhand who had once begged for mercy now bared his teeth in a grin. The boy who had spoken first clutched his chest, as if proud of what he had begun, and then another voice, hoarse but eager, rose above the crackle of flames. "She's right. We must keep the fire alive." Their gazes darted around the room, searching for the next sacrifice. No one was safe anymore. Accusations flew like knives. Old debts, grudges, whispered suspicions, each became a reason to condemn. He lied to us. She hid food. He was going to run. One by one, they were seized. One by one, they were thrown into the furnace. The chamber became a theater of shrieks and crackling flames, a ritual of ash and smoke. By the time the frenzy slowed, half of them were gone. The survivors stood in a circle, their faces streaked with soot and blood, their chests heaving in unison. They no longer looked like prisoners, they looked like disciples. Isabella raised her burned hand high above her head. "Now you see, the fire does not demand all of you, only the unworthy, only the weak, and those who remain. You are the chosen." Her voice broke them open. Some wept with relief, others fell to their knees before her. The furnace glowed behind her like a crown of flame, and in that moment they no longer feared Isabella Montoya. They worshipped her. The chamber no longer felt like a prison. The smell of ash and bone hung heavy, but the survivors breathed it in as if it were incense. Their eyes no longer darted in fear. They fixed on Isabella with a feverish devotion, waiting for her next word. She stepped forward, her shadow cast long by the furnace glow. The skin of her arms was cracked and blackened, but she held them wide as if to embrace her new flock. "You have burned away your weakness," she told them. "You have proven yourselves worthy of the fire." The boy who had condemned the old man fell to his knees. "What are we now?" he asked, his voice breaking. Isabella looked down at him, her gaze piercing and slow. Then, in a voice that carried like thunder through the stone chamber, she said, "You are the Ashen." The name struck them like a spark in dry tinder. One by one they whispered it to themselves, "The Ashen," until the whispers became a chant that filled the chamber, rising and falling with the rhythm of the flames. She pointed to the furnace, its fire dancing as if alive. "This is no longer a tool of death. This is our altar. The world cast you aside, families abandoned you, masters enslaved you, but here, in fire, you are reborn. The fire is truth, the fire is purity, and through me, the fire has chosen you." Their faces glistened with sweat, eyes wide with rapture. The farmhand tore strips of cloth from his own shirt and threw them into the flames as an offering. The widow who had begged for her life pressed her forehead to the floor, trembling as if in prayer. Isabella stepped among them, touching each forehead with her blackened fingers. "From ash you were broken, in ash you will rise." When she returned to stand before the furnace, silence fell. Every pair of eyes followed her, every breath held in her presence. Then, softly but with venom beneath her tone, Isabella gave them their first cone. "Ammon as the Ashen. Go, gather the others, bring them here. Let the world burn with us." The chant returned, louder, fiercer. "Ashen, Ashen, Ashen." The fire roared, fed not by flesh this time, but by belief. And Isabella Montoya, once victim, once monster, now stood as something far greater, something the world outside would never understand until it was too late. The chant shook the chamber until dust rained down from the ceiling. Isabella raised her hand, and silence snapped into place like the crack of a whip. Her eyes burned with an intensity that outshone the furnace behind her. "You are no longer shadows hiding in chains," she said. "You are fire given flesh, and fire does not stay still. Fire spreads." The Ashen bowed, their faces streaked with soot, their bodies trembling with a mix of fear and ecstasy. The boy clutched the furnace door, kissing its iron frame as if it were holy. The widow held her hands in the flame until her skin blistered, but she did not scream. She smiled. Isabella moved to the heavy door at the end of the chamber, the one that had always been locked against escape. With a single push, it groaned open. Cold night air rushed in, sweeping through the smoke, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and pine. For the first time, the cult felt the world outside waiting. She stepped into the darkness, her followers trailing behind like shadows fused to her will. Each one carried something burning, torches ripped from the wall, scraps of cloth aflame, embers cupped in hands that bled but did not falter. When they emerged onto the hillside, the world below them lay silent and unknowing. Fields stretched into the distance, dotted with the faint glow of plantation houses. Families slept. Masters dreamed. Children turned in their beds. None of them knew the fire was already coming. Isabella lifted her arm, and her voice cut the night. Tonight, the world learns what you are. No one will cage you again. No one will silence you. You are ashen, and you will burn the world clean. The flames in their hands flared as if the fire itself had answered. Their chant returned, louder, sharper, carried on the wind. Ashen, ashen, ashen. From the hillside, their silhouettes glowed against the firelight. They moved layered, like a tide of shadows descending toward the sleeping world. The night itself seemed to bend around them, as if the land already knew it was doomed. Behind them, the furnace roared alone in the chamber, now empty of victims but alive with the power it had birthed. The fire did not fade. It waited. It remembered. And so the legend began, not of Isabella the victim, not of Isabella the murderer, but of Isabella the prophet of fire, whose ashen would spread her gospel of flame until nothing remained but smoke and silence.